Well, we're happy to have Heidi Harendza with us this afternoon, and of late there have been some oral history interviews with current and past commissioners, and I thought that you would bring an interesting perspective to the Oral History Project because you're both a resident of German Village and you work for the City of Columbus in Historic Preservation and actually attended the commission meetings.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So do you mind just starting by letting us know a little bit about what your position was with the city? And
Sure. I was an assistant historic preservation officer for the City of Columbus, and the Historic Preservation Office, they managed the 5 commissions in the City of Columbus, as well as I think it was at that time like 20 different individually registered historic buildings throughout the City of Columbus. And it managed when projects are proposed for the exterior of historic buildings or buildings in a historic district in Columbus, the City of Columbus has a process by which those projects are reviewed by the office to make sure that they don't impact the integrity of the historic buildings that are listed by the city. So it's a tremendous amount of buildings with the 5 districts, and I want to say there were like 10,000 buildings that are registered, something along those lines. So it kept us pretty busy in the office, and I had responsibility for German Village for I think about 3 years that I was there. So it was a great opportunity.
so what was your background that brought you to that position?
I started out in New Jersey. I was I started in historic preservation when I got out of undergraduate. I went to Penn State, and one of our professors there had a little class on historic architecture, and it got me hooked. And so after graduation, I worked for my local community in New Jersey for about, 8 years, something like that. And I did a dual position working with their historic commission and as a manager of their kind of city-owned historic site, and worked with their historical society there. And then I went back to grad school at the University of Delaware and in their urban affairs and public policy department. And it's a specialization in historic preservation. And after I graduated, I decided I was looking for some new challenges. And my brother lives over in Dayton, so I thought, Columbus, Dayton, it's a good fit. And I saw a job opening, and 6 months later, I was here.
Okay. And so when you moved to Columbus, is that when you moved to German Village?
It was, yeah. It's funny, I was thinking about this last night because they took me on, I really knew nothing about the city when I came here. I knew nothing about the area, and I remember coming in for my job interview and kind of being a little surprised by how big Columbus was, because I was driving into downtown and I was like, this is bigger than I thought it was going to be. And after my interview, they gave me a little tour of the city, since I was one of the few people from out of town that had come in for the job interviews. And they took me to eat at Barcelona restaurant, and I thought, wow, I could live here. This is great, So I always think of Barcelona as being what sold me on the city of Columbus.
So when you took the position, were you at that time assigned to German Village for the commission?
No, initially I was assigned to Victorian Village. We each had, well, at that time we each covered one commission. There were 4 members 4 assistant preservation specialists that all had essentially one commission, or 1 or 2, but usually the 2 of the smaller commissions would be linked together, or German Village and the Brewery District, something like that. But no, initially I just had Victorian Village, and then as we had some shakeups within the office, people leaving, people coming, that sort of thing, we changed around to better adapt to those changes as well. So I eventually worked with the German Village Commission. I think it was about a year or 2 after I started working there, I swapped over to the German Village Commission.
And so you said that there were 5 different districts within the city of Columbus for the commissions, and I wonder if you if you could talk a little bit about how German Village was unique amongst the other ones.
That's always interesting. They're really they all have very individual characteristics, and it's interesting because each of the commissions did their work a little bit differently. Now, I can't speak to all of them because I only worked with, I never worked with the Brewery District except maybe to fill in once or twice. And again, with Italian Village as well, I, would fill in with them. But, and a lot of it comes out of the characteristics of the buildings that they work with. So the Historic Resources Commission, which has a lot of the smaller districts in the city and some of the newer districts, so things like Old Town East or Old Beachwold or Bryden Road, those kinds of areas where their challenges are a lot different because, say for example, looking at a project up in Old Beachwold, the houses are just different. The characteristics of the historic neighborhood is different. Here in German Village, both the beauty and the challenge is that, pretty much everything here has some, how do I say this, adds to the character of the neighborhood. So the sidewalks, the curbs, the streets, literally the paving materials, the brick houses, the landscaping, almost all of them have some significance here. So it's very difficult because people would, how do I say, anytime that there was a change, somebody would be like, hey, that's valuable. Hey, that's important. And the community is so active here and people are so aware of what they have and so aware of the history of the neighborhood and the significance of the neighborhood that it was just a really active place. People were always calling for information. My neighbor's working on something, has this been reviewed? And in a great way, because it made it a really active community to work with, and you really had a lot of buy-in to the process. And I've always said that's kind of, historic districts are, can sometimes be thought of as a hindrance. People are like, oh, I'm going to paint my house pink, and then some people really love to live in the historic districts because they love the history and they love the significance and they love the kind of the timeless quality that happens with them. And there's always a little bit of tension when it's your property and it's your neighborhood, and especially if you're a volunteer and you put a lot of hours into volunteering, that tension is a good thing though. And I've always said that the most successful projects happen when you have a really strong grassroots support from the community, you have good government oversight, and you have good nonprofit organization to help organize the group. And I think that's what always made German Village so successful, is that it had the strong nonprofit organization to kind of organize a lot of the volunteer activities to make sure that the people who wanted to help had a channel to help. It had a strong support from the community, from just the individuals that live here. And then, it had a good government organization to kind of make sure it all, was the glue that held the whole thing together. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was wonderful. So. Right,
and sometimes our biggest assets can also be our biggest headaches.
Spider-Man says your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. Yeah.
So what would Spider-Man say about the commission in German Village from your perspective?
I always that. How do I say this? Being a commissioner is a very, very hard job. And there were times when I would sit through those meetings and I would think, I am so glad I don't have to vote on this. Because, and yet it's so important. I look back and it's like, it's so important to have people who are really dedicated to the job, because they really were. When you think, I look back, Michael Rosen was on our commission at the time when I was working. He had been a commissioner for, I think it was 30 years. Since the commission was established. And I looked back and having that, just that wealth of history, that wealth of what do we call it at work? The sort of the living knowledge of how the commission had evolved over the years, different projects, how that the continuity that he would bring to some of the decision making. And you know, he would rub people the wrong way sometimes because he was very blunt, and he was like, you know, we've had this conversation 100 times before. We don't really need to have this again. And that, you know, sometimes there was a shorthand that commissioners would have, because after you've listened to, you know, 45 window applications, you kind of know, you have a sense of where it goes, but it's an experience that you have to gain. You know, you don't just walk into a commission meeting and learn how the process works, and these decisions are not always self-explanatory. I mean, we try to make the process as black and white as possible so that it provides an opportunity to for people to understand it and have it be clear. But it is also an aesthetic process in some ways, in determining what's an appropriate project or non-appropriate project. So a lot of the decisions are very difficult, and I always have the greatest admiration for the commissioners excuse me, that try and do that job, because I mean, I remember in the height of sort of the real estate boom, I mean, we would be there until midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning sometimes, and to sit there, to have people sit in 8 hours of meetings looking at applications, I mean, that's dedication, and people would just be exhausted by the end of the night. And if anybody thinks it's just, you know, I've heard people say, oh, it's a power trip, or they really like to tell their neighbors what to do or whatever. And I thought, you try it. They come to brown bag meetings. They dedicate, you know, daytime hours doing these brown bags. Many of the commissioners, I mean, gosh, Brent Warner would visit every project site. He would walk to everyone. He would look at it in person from, you know, around the back, peep it over. I mean, you know, he would... Sorry, that sounds a little weird, but he would, you know, I mean, he really tried to get a sense of where the project was going to be, how it would affect the neighbors, you know, what types of impact it might have on the neighborhood, would it change the historic character? And I mean, he spent hours, you know, just hours, because he loved the neighborhood. And I just think to myself, if people, you really need to walk in their shoes for a while before you make a judgment on why people do this, because it's an important job and they spend a lot of time doing it. Mm-hmm. So, you know.
So you said that you were glad that you didn't have to vote in the end for things.
Sometimes. Yeah. And sometimes I wanted to vote really badly.
So can you speak about both sides of that? Some specific projects? Or,
you know, gosh, I have to say, I blocked out some of the worst ones and remember some of the better ones. Yeah. You know, voting, it was just hard because it's hard not to, as an employee, and my style was to work usually pretty closely with the applicants and to try and let them know what they were going to experience when they got to the commission table, because it can be very intimidating. You come in and you know, you're looking to get a new fence or something, and you've got 7 people up there judging you on how nice your fence looks. You know, it can be a very intimidating process. But I think most of the commissioners tried to make it as comfortable as possible to work with people. But there were always applications where again, with design issues. People would come in, and again, you'd have I can't think of one in particular where I was like, oh, I really wanted to vote on this or something, but there were projects where, you know, I remember a couple of times where, how do I say this? I'll give a good example. Some of the commissioners would be more traditional historian types. And Brent Warner was always one that he was very much a traditional historian and would look very closely at let's say you have a building that's built in 3 parts. Is there a part that's really historic? Is there a part that maybe was built in 1972 and isn't adding much to the history of the neighborhood, or looks a little awkward and wasn't such a good decision made when they built that extra section on, and that it would work to improve the building, and it's not a historic section, so we can maybe demolish that part or put something on. And again, those decisions aren't hard and fast. Oftentimes you need to look at something and say, does the design work? Is it contributing? Is it non-contributing? And he was a real historian type that would look very carefully into it. He always consulted the Sanborn maps to see what had been on that site previously. And if you don't know what the Sanborn maps are, they're old insurance maps, but they show the buildings and they show them over slices of time. So you might have one from 1888 and another from 1915. So you can see how the footprint of the building changes over time. And it's a tremendous asset to be able to use that to look at buildings in different ways.
We're talking about how different commissioners have come from different backgrounds. You mentioned Brett Warner was a very traditionalist as far as history was a historian.
Absolutely.
And Mark Orrs, who's current, is an architect, and how he brings a different perspective.
Brings a real design sensibility to the commission. Again, Cheryl Hacker, who was the chairman while I was working there, she's a lawyer and just had a real methodical approach to the work that the commission did, and was always very, thank God, was very process oriented too, to make sure people got fair hearings and to make sure that because it is a sort of, they call it almost like almost a quasi judicial process that the commissions use, where part of it is a hearing, and it needs to be public, and there are laws that go along with making sure that you have public notice and those types of things. So there's a lot to the legalities of what the commission does, but in that they also try and make it approachable enough so that everybody in the neighborhood can do it.
Mm-hmm. You were mentioning also that these are people's private homes, and
Absolutely.
They're coming and they're wanting to make a change, and
it's deeply personal.
Because they want to better their property. So.
Yes, and you would always and one thing that one person, and again, it's so deeply personal to most people. It's their homes. It's their oftentimes the thing that they've really strived for to live in German Village and to have a property here. It's always I don't know if accomplishment is the right word, but a lot of people really want to live in the neighborhood. It's an amazing place. When you look at the changes over a period of time, you start in one point, you end in another, and you see how much a building has changed over a 30 or 40 year period. You don't realize how much it's changed over that time period. You realize that those small changes do add up. And if it seems like it's a very minor issue, or it's just one window, it's just one door, the other thing is those rules have to apply to everybody equally. So one window on your house that might be on a back elevation somewhere that you think, this is completely unimportant. But those same rules have to apply to somebody else, and that other window that they want to change out might be a really important one on a street somewhere. And so you want to make sure that everything gets applied even-handedly, and that it doesn't seem like it's favoritism or one person. And gosh, that always makes me think of, a lot of the work that the commission does isn't just, I don't know, people will be like, that person always gets their projects done. This architect always works in German Village, and he or she is always, they can get their projects through, no problem. And I think to myself, but a lot of these people do this every month, every Tuesday, first Tuesday of the month, they're in that meeting. They hear, they see, they have experience in how projects should be designed, or how projects should be should happen. And a lot of them, are very good at making sure that you understand, and that there's a trust level that builds up with the commission too, that the project that you say you're going to produce is the project that actually happens, because that can be a real problem when you have, you say we're going to do it this way, and then for whatever reason, it might not turn out the way they thought it was going to on the plans, or there was some miscommunication. That can be very difficult to deal with. So it's there's all that and more can happen, and I've dealt with it.
And so, was there an enforcement component to your position?
Yeah, in that we worked with the code enforcement branch pretty closely of the City of Columbus. The code enforcement office deals with most of the enforcement issues that go along with if somebody does work without a certificate of appropriateness. And their job is just, it's tremendous. I don't know how they do it, because I had tremendous respect for the code enforcement officers that work for the City of Columbus. They're really, really, it's a difficult job. So I don't know what else to say about that, but we worked pretty closely with them. So we would always kind of be the flip side of the coin, that they were we were how they resolved that process, resolved the code enforcement issues. So once people had a code, if they had a code issue, they would come into our office to get a certificate of appropriateness to continue to move their project forward. And again, I always tried to work pretty closely with people, to tell them the issues that had happened with, if they had done something. A lot of people just don't know. And that there's always that tension between, you need to be a good civic, citizen, and do your research before you move into a historic district. A lot of people just don't know what the process is, and they move into the neighborhood and just don't have any sense of what that entails. But then the flip side is that sometimes it's really good to try and get that information out there. Certainly the websites and things like that have helped a lot. It used to be a lot more difficult to give people, just things like the paperwork, the application you need to fill out to get things done. So I think that's really, those types of ease of access has really actually made our jobs a lot easier.
Yeah, I remember running down to get it in by the time, however many days before
and we still need to do that. I mean, that used to drive me crazy, because we have to have our agendas out, a certain time beforehand, and we always really tried to have them finalized a week before the meeting so that we could properly publicize the information. And gosh, it used to make me crazy, because, and I'm not going to name names, but there were a couple people that would always push the deadline for me, and they'd be like, "Oh, well, the commission meeting's not for another week," and I'm like, "But my agenda's due tomorrow." You have to give me some time to review this information and make sure it's complete and make sure it's and half the time the drawing, especially for the architects, the drawings wouldn't be done, and they wouldn't have a north arrow on them and things like that. It used to drive me crazy. It drove the architects crazy. I'm on the commission, let me tell you. Yeah. Mr. Rosen would get very salty when the architects didn't have at least a north arrow or a plan to show where the property lines were.
So, as a resident of German Village, have you ever had to go to the commission?
Oh, all the time. I was there 2 days ago. Oh.
So what was that? What's that experience?
It's different on the other side. That's why I say it's different on the other side of the table when you're the one. And again, I've done a couple projects on my house, but most of mine have been projects that have been, replacement of siding or paint colors or things like that I haven't had to go to the commission for. Yeah, it's different on the other side of the table. It's nerve-wracking, and that's, like I said, I always knew that when I was an employee, but boy, it makes a difference when it's your property and you're sitting there with the white knuckles and I want to get this done, or I have a comment to make, or I have issues with what's going on. So, but yeah, it was nervous. I was nervous.
Yeah. And how about having lived here and being part of the City of Columbus Historic Preservation? What was
You know, I'm sort of on the north end, so I kept a low profile while I was working at the city. Mm-hmm. But you know, I had to laugh when I moved here. I moved into an apartment just down from the park, and I kind of decided right away that I was gonna look around for a house. And I still remember talking to my realtor at the time, and you know, you put together your wish list, and you know, I'm like, well, I have X amount of dollars to spend, and I want a brick house, a German village with this many bedrooms and this many bathrooms, and you know, and a garage, and I want it for this price. And she laughed at me, you know, and she was like, you're never gonna find that. And I still remember to the day, I was sort of flipping along the internet, and I saw my house, and it, you know, it didn't have the garage, but it had 2 parking spaces. So I was like, ooh. And I walked into the house, and I thought, I have to have this house. This is my house. And you know, I've never regretted buying it because I love the neighborhood. And you know, I remember kind of looking at different neighborhoods. I always wanted to live in a historic neighborhood, but a lot of times my friends from New Jersey will call me and they'll be like, well, why don't you come back to New Jersey? And I'm like, I don't really need to. I like it here, you know. And I think to myself, you know, I took a vacation, and it was like a stay-at-home vacation where I just had a week off, and I'd walk to the coffee shops and walk my dogs down the street and do my little thing. And I thought, this is just like a vacation every day. You know, people come here to visit and vacation, and I get to live here. And I just thought that was, I really do appreciate that, because it just seems to me like this is exactly, you know, I'll go to different cities or different places, and you know, I walk through New York or you know, New Orleans or something, and that's what I go there to do, is just absorb the neighborhood and walk down the, you know, the crazy cobblestone streets or whatever, and it's my home, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure over the time that you were with the city, there were projects that you really loved, and some that maybe weren't so dear to your heart.
Well, as I was saying, I'm always amazed by walking past. What is this called now? Beck Place?
The Beck Place condo.
Yes,
yeah.
This one is always one that I walk by, and I'm really proud that I worked on this one. And I was saying earlier, I have a little bit of ownership over this one, because it was a long project, and there was a lot of really, you know, good, kind of good decision making about, you know, what were historic sections of the building, and it was such a different type of building in German Village, because it's more of a industrial or commercial type of building here, and you know, the majority of properties are more residential in character in German Village. We don't have as much of the commercial buildings. That it's such a unique place that I felt that they got it right in terms of the pieces that they kept, and the pieces that were just not really that. You know, there was a loading dock that was a dispatch newspaper loading dock that was just a big open area, and it, you know, so that part got taken off, and you know, new pieces were filled in around it, and the design I thought was really clever, with some of the townhouses on the more residential street on Grant, and these stayed more industrial looking on the Jaeger side. And so I think it was B. Hall Sampson Dietz at that time did the project, and I thought they were it was a good plan. It was a good use of the space and how the space interacted with the street, and I thought it came out really nicely. I mean, I think the buildings look. The hardest thing is always to make them look new, and yet also to make them look like they fit in with the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I really think this project did that in a really good way. You know, they look modern. You're not going to mistake them for old houses. But they just fit seamlessly. You walk by and they just fit seamlessly in with the neighborhood, and that's a really hard thing to do from a design perspective. So,
yeah,
you know,
there aren't a lot of new builds.
No. Well, and I still.
Village,
Yeah, there aren't. And a lot of things, it was like, I mean, you'd be surprised though, there are more than you think there are. And that's always people find a way to squeeze a new house onto a tiny little lot somewhere, or a section that was old. And I still remember the one, one of the, this sounds so silly, but gosh, I can't remember the family's name, but they lived around the corner. They live around the corner from me, and they put in a new garage, and they were just doing some modifications to the back of their house. And I remember they came in and they were really, nervous isn't the right word, but I think they felt like they were going to be in for a fight with the commission about things. And I had met with them and I was like, look, why don't we bring this in for a conceptual review, which the commission, for a lot of new projects, they have this process called a conceptual review, which allows the commission to give some feedback on the project without having to take a vote on it or anything like that. So it's a slightly more informal discussion, and it gives them some opportunity to give some design feedback in a less formal way, and maybe sketch some ideas, or and hopefully provide a little bit more time so that they're not under pressure. They tend to be at the end of the meeting, so they have a little bit more time to discuss, and it's less formal. And I recommended that they do the conceptual review, and then they came in for a vote the following month. And the conceptual review went really well, and they got some really good feedback from the commissioners at that time. Just some ways to make they were doing like a bathroom addition on the back in the garage, and the way that the landscaping worked with all of those items. And I remember gosh, I wish I could remember their names. I can't think of it right now. Anyway, they said afterwards, he was like, I think we got a much better project out of this because of this process. And I think that this is going to be really good. And every time I walk by their house, I remember how the project started out, and I don't want to say how much better it looked. It did look much better, just from the way the landscaping, little subtle tweaks in the landscaping, and how they adjusted it to make sure that the driveway didn't take over the whole front yard, which it kind of had initially, and how the garage, you don't really notice it from the street because it's set back behind their property. And he said afterwards, he was like, we got a much better project out of this, thank you. And I thought, that's why I do the job, it was great.
You gave a sense of really working together.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you're accurate in saying that people are a little overwhelmed when they go and worried that the project's not going to come through. So
and that happens. I mean, that's there are instances where that but I would say 90. Significant numbers of them really. There's very few times when it's just an absolute no, you can't do this. There's usually a way to manage it. I mean, and some things, it's hard. The harder ones are more like, things like parking or curb cuts. Those kinds of things are always really hard because it's difficult to shoehorn cars into a tiny little lot and manage to have some yard and some sense of streetscape too. So those were always really the difficult ones.
Yeah. And I wonder if you encountered difficulty with people who sometimes had trouble being able to afford what the standards were in renovations.
Sometimes. I will say this though, for the most part, I was going to say sometimes yes, but really not too often. Again, most of the time it tended to be more of a, let's use an example of things like vinyl windows, which people really have been sold that these are better, they're more efficient, they're more whatever. And for, German Village has been pretty consistent in how they approached that topic. And, or the topic of replacement windows, let's say. And I always felt like there is a difference in investment versus a cheap window replacement versus really doing it for the long haul. But I also felt like sometimes if you make sure that people are putting the appropriate windows in and making sure that they're sized to fit the opening of the window, that you usually get a pretty good product out of it. And if you are going to do a project, the product should be one that lasts another 100 years. And that's always really been the aim for the commission, is to try and make sure that the materials it's not just a throwaway community, and that has to be reflected in how people treat the community. And so I think for the most part, people understand that, though. I mean, windows was always the hardest thing, because they're expensive and they're difficult. I mean, roofing to a certain extent can be that way too. I mean, especially with the slate roofs, because there are so many different choices among roofing materials now that that's always been sort of the harder piece to do. But other than that, I mean, a lot of it is really about just making good design choices, because the difference between bad design and good design often isn't a monetary thing. It's just making sure that you have things sized properly and proportioned in a way that makes the scale of the building look right. I've seen that, and I still even remember talking to, there was a house that looks kind of homely, and it has siding and replacement windows and stuff on it. And actually, I'm sorry, it didn't have replacement windows. It just had some siding and had some upgrades done to it that make it look less historic. And as I was talking to a gentleman about the property, he was like, well, is this historic? Is this something that could, be? And I remember looking at the property and thinking, this really isn't different than any of the other buildings that are really nice buildings, but it's just had some things that obscure the historic features of the house. And it was a simple cottage, so it's a matter of the wood siding and the wood windows, and part of the beauty of some of these buildings are the dimension that they have because of the wood siding that gets put on them. So, you might have a very dimensional wood siding with another layer of trim on top of that, and then another layer of trim, and then a ornate roof cornice or something like that, or a decorative porch. And as those layers gradually get stripped down and it flattens down, the houses start to look less attractive. And I just remember saying, all you really need to do is to fix this house, or to make it look like it belongs in German Village, is to put the original trim back on and take off the siding, and it's going to look exactly like all of the gorgeous cottages in German Village. And as I said that to him, the gentleman who was talking to me on the phone was like, paused, and he was like, you're right. And he was like, okay, I got it. And and that was really amazing to me, because when people can kind of picture that transformation, and again, it's those small changes that make that really make the difference between a building looking like a German Village cottage, or looking like a historic building, and looking sort of not that great, can be very, very small. So
well, it seems like it was very rewarding to be in that position.
It was wonderful. I love the job. It was the hardest job I've ever done. And I mean, I would work late at night, and I'd be there at 6:30 on Friday night calling people and making sure they knew that what they had to do for the commission meetings and things. And but it was great. I really, the most satisfying thing is because I live here, I walk around the neighborhood and I see projects that I've worked on, and I thought, I had a little bit to do with that, and that's, I don't know, the architects that work here have got to feel great, because it's like, to see something from paper to brick and mortar and stone, and it's wonderful. So yeah, I take a little pride in it.
Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, you guys thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been nice to add my piece in. I hope I don't know, gave a perspective to people on how to
sure.
and how it worked.
I certainly appreciate your perspective, because it's a little different than how we've approached it in the past. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.